Sometimes things happen so quickly, they seem almost unfair. Maybe a single insult, a single decision, a single trigger. Less than 5 seconds can become more famous than the lives that came before them. One man would become one of the greatest legends of the American frontier. The other would become little more than a footnote attached to the story. But neither man woke up that morning expecting to be remembered in exactly this way. Join me today as I tell the story of a friendship that collapsed over pride, a gold watch that became worth more than a man's life, and a gunfight that changed the American West forever. Thanks to many, many years of American movies, when most people picture the old American West, they imagine two men standing in the middle of a dusty street with their hands hovering above polished pistols, polished revolvers. The wind rolls across the empty ground, doors close, curtains move ever so slightly as frightened townspeople peek through the window. Maybe a tumbleweed blows across the road between the two men, and a tense silence settles over everything before two shots break the afternoon completely apart. It is one of the most recognizable images in American history because of the movies. The strange thing is that almost none of those famous movie scenes ever actually happened that way. Most frontier gunfights were pretty chaotic affairs. Some happened inside of saloons, others began as drunken brawls. Many involved people firing wildly in different directions, which was considerably less cinematic and considerably more dangerous for anybody around. Yet there was one confrontation that came surprisingly close to this legend. It happened on a warm July afternoon in Springfield, Missouri. And it would launch one man that we all know and we've all heard of into immortality. To understand why that afternoon mattered so much, we have to meet James Butler Hickok before he became known as Wild Bill. Legends have a particular habit of arriving pretty much fully formed, as though they were born wearing buckskin and carrying revolvers, especially legends of the Old West. Real people are rarely ever so neatly put inside of a little box. But Hickok entered the world in Illinois in 1837, the son of a farmer who was also helping enslaved people escape through the Underground Railroad. So he grew up during a pretty rough period of time when the frontier justice often arrived long before official justice. By his late teen years, he had left home after believing he had killed a man during a fight, although the man did actually survive. The misunderstanding pushed Mr. Hickok westward, where reinvention was often easier than trying to explain yourself. The frontier rewarded unusual talents, and Hickok had several. He was an exceptional marksman. He worked as a stagecoach driver, a scout, a teamster, a lawman, a gambler, and occasionally something difficult to describe neatly because the frontier rarely offered tidy job descriptions for people that did what he did back then. During the American Civil War, he served the Union as a scout and spy. Those experiences sharpened his ability to remain calm under pressure, but they also introduced him to the uncomfortable reality that violence could become routine if one allowed it to become. Long before anyone called him a gunfighter, Hickok had already learned that surviving dangerous situations often depended less on speed than on your own judgment. That lesson would serve him very well, although not always happily. By the summer of 1865, the war had ended, but peace had not yet settled comfortably across the state of Missouri. Old loyalties lingered. Former Union soldiers and former Confederates often found themselves living side by side, trying to build new lives while carrying old memories and old grievances. Springfield reflected that uneasy balance. Saloons were busy and gambling tables pretty much always stayed crowded. Conversations could shift from friendly laughter to bitter arguments with astonishing speed. Yet amid that uncertainty, something unexpected happened. Hickok became unlikely friends with a former Confederate named Davis Tutt. Considering the recent war, it might have seemed unlikely, but poker has a way of it has this remarkable ability to bring people together who pretty much would disagree about nearly everything except whose turn it is to shuffle the cards and deal. Well, Davis Tutt came from a family that had already experienced more violence than most people would encounter in several lifetimes. Members of the Tutt family had been caught in the deadly Tutt-Everett feud in Arkansas years earlier, and it left scars that did not disappear just because time had passed. After serving in the Confederate Army, Davis drifted to Springfield, where gambling offered both income and a sense of companionship. He and Hickok developed kind of an odd friendship that was built on mutual respect and occasional loans and countless hours of gambling tables and gambling side by side. They were different men in many ways, yet they understood one another well enough that Tutt sometimes lent Hickok money without much concern. That sort of trust doesn't develop overnight. That's easy to see. But it's also interesting to acknowledge that these two came from deeply rooted, different backgrounds. And they overlooked those backgrounds to have this friendship. They had varying beliefs, and yet they put those beliefs aside to have this friendship. And like many friendships built around gambling, however, theirs rested on fragile ground. Money changes conversations. Pride changes them even faster. Hickok owed Tutt a debt. Historians continue to debate whether that amount was $25 or $35, but the precise figure hardly really matters because the argument soon stopped being about math. Around another poker table, surrounded by fellow gamblers, Davis Tutt demanded that Hickok pay him right then and there. That's not how you reclaim a debt, number one. But Hickok acknowledged the debt, but disputed the amount. Neither man raised a weapon right then. Neither shouted loudly enough to alarm the room. Yet everyone present understood that the discussion had shifted away from the amount of dollars. They were now negotiating with their reputations. Then came the decision that transformed an ordinary disagreement into something so much more dangerous. Tutt reached across the table and took Hickok's gold Waltham pocket watch as collateral. Today, that might sound like an inconvenience, but in 1865, it was a deeply personal insult. It was like slapping somebody with a glove. This was a challenge. A professional gambler depended almost entirely upon his reputation. If other players believed that he did not honor his debts, his livelihood completely vanished. Hickok allowed Tutt to take the watch, but he added one quiet warning that carried considerable more weight than its calm delivery might have suggested. He told Tutt not to wear it in public. There's something fascinating about warnings that are delivered without any sense of anger. People often suspect or expect some kind of shouting before violence. History repeatedly reminds us that calm voices can be much more ominous. Tutt left with the watch, apparently convinced that he still had the upper hand, and Hickok returned to his room. Around Springfield, the story spread with astonishing speed. By early evening, everyone connected to the gambling community knew exactly what had happened that day at the table. Some believed the matter would kind of cool overnight. You just give them time. But others suspected that they had just witnessed the opening chapter of something far more serious. The frontier had no shortage of disagreements, but this one possessed an uncomfortable quality that experienced observers recognized immediately. This needed to be taken a bit more seriously. Neither man's pride had room left for retreat. The following morning, Springfield awoke as it always had. Businesses opened. Wagons rolled through the streets. Merchants arranged the goods outside of their shops. We're not yet seeing the people peeking through the curtains and the tumbleweeds drifting across the roads. But children played and travelers came and went, and nothing about the town suggested that before the day was over, one of the most famous gunfighters in American history and one of the most famous gunfights in American history would unfold in its public square. History happens in places that appear perfectly ordinary until suddenly they're not. As the hours passed, rumors multiplied. Someone claimed that Tutt intended to make an example out of Hickok. Someone else insisted that Hickok would ignore the insult. Another swore both men had already settled their differences privately. Rumors have always traveled faster than facts, particularly in towns where entertainment could be scarce and speculation costs absolutely nothing except someone else's reputation. Yet one report continued surfacing again and again. Davis Tutt intended to wear the watch openly where everyone could see it. Another slap to the face. If that rumor were true, Springfield was about to discover whether one man's warning had been merely words or deep down a promise. Well, of course, the rumor proved to be true. Sometime during the afternoon, Davis Tutt walked into Springfield's public square with Hickok's gold watch hanging plainly where everyone could see it. It was not hidden beneath his coat. It was not tucked away discreetly into a pocket watch pocket. It was displayed boldly. Whether Tutt intended only to embarrass Hickok or to force a final confrontation has been debated ever since. But intentions often become less important than consequences. People noticed this immediately. One person pointed it out to another, and then another. Conversations slowed, and eyes followed Tutt across the square. Before long, someone found Hickok, and they quietly delivered the news to him. There are moments when a person can still choose to walk away from a fight or an argument. This may have been one of them. If so, neither man decided to take it. Hickok stepped into the square with remarkable composure. Witnesses later described him as calm rather than angry, and deliberate rather than hurried. That calmness has always fascinated historians because it suggests a man who had already accepted whatever might happen next. And across the open marketplace, roughly 75 yards away, stood Davis Tutt. The distance itself was extraordinary. Most men carrying revolvers of the day would have struggled to hit much of anything at that range under ideal conditions, let alone another armed man standing in the middle of the town square. Yet neither of them seemed eager to shorten that distance. Between them stretched nothing more than dirt, scattered pedestrians hurriedly stepping aside, and the heavy silence that sometimes settled over a crowd before history changes directions with a sharp U-turn. Hickok called out to Tutt. He demanded that he return his watch, and Tutt answered. Accounts differ on what words were exactly exchanged, but they agree on the essentials. Neither man backed down. Neither attempted to leave. They stood facing one another, squaring off, each fully aware that hundreds of eyes might soon witness what happened next. Modern films often portray gunfighters fidgeting nervously before a duel. Reality can be quite strange. Sometimes the stillest of people are the ones who have already made up their minds. It has often been observed that courage and stubbornness look remarkably alike until the shooting starts. But then came the moment that would be replayed in books and paintings and newspaper columns and documentaries and countless Western films. Both men reached for their pistols. 2 shots rang out so close together that several witnesses believed that they had only heard one. Tutt's bullet flew harmlessly right past Hickok. Hickok's Colt Navy revolver fired a single round that crossed approximately 75 yards and struck Tutt directly in the chest. The ball pierced his heart. Tutt staggered backward several steps before reportedly saying, "Boys, I'm killed," and collapsing onto the dusty ground. The entire confrontation had lasted only seconds. Years of friendship, weeks of growing resentment, and hours of mounting tension had all been distilled into one trigger pull. Most people assumed that that was the moment when Wild Bill Hickok became famous. In truth, his legend had still yet another obstacle to overcome. Authorities arrested him, and they charged him with manslaughter. Many believed a conviction was inevitable. After all, two armed men had deliberately confronted one another in public, and one of them was dead. But yet, during the trial, witnesses described Tutt's actions in displaying the watch despite Hickok's warnings. They described the challenge that everyone in Springfield understood without anyone needing to explain it aloud. The jury ultimately accepted that Hickok had acted under circumstances they believed justified acquittal. Modern legal scholars still debate this verdict, but at the time it transformed Hickok from an exceptionally skilled marksman into a man whose reputation suddenly caught the weight of the law behind it. If the trial made Hickok known, a magazine made him immortal. Journalist George Ward Nicholas published an article portraying Hickok as an almost superhuman frontier gunfighter whose exploits bordered on the unbelievable. Some details were accurate, others were highly embellished. Still others almost certainly belonged somewhere between fact and enthusiastic storytelling. Hickok himself occasionally seemed amused by the growing mythology surrounding him and his name. Once a legend begins gathering momentum, it rarely asks before growing larger. Before long, Wild Bill Hickok had become one of the defining figures of the American frontier, inspiring dime store novels and stage productions and eventually motion pictures. Ironically, countless fictional Western showdowns owe their existence to one very real confrontation over a borrowed sum of money and a pocket watch. Davis Tutt's name slowly faded in the background, while Hickok's became legendary. Yet history is kinder when it remembers both men. Tutt was not simply the man who lost the duel. He was a son who had survived a family violence, a soldier who had lived through Civil War, a gambler trying to build a future in a country still recovering from enormous wounds. Hickok was not merely an unbeatable gunfighter. He was a complicated man whose fame often obscured the quieter parts of his life and whose own story would eventually end with a bullet fired from behind while he was what became known as the dead man's hand. The famous duel in Springfield has often been celebrated as the birth of the classic Western gunfight. But beneath the legend rests a much simpler truth. There were two men who reached a point where neither could imagine stepping backward, and the result became permanent. Pride is remarkably expensive currency because it is usually paid with something that cannot be earned back. Give up your pride. Even the straightest road eventually reaches a graveyard. What do you think decided the outcome long before either man ever drew a pistol? Was it the gambling debt, the public humiliation, or the refusal of either man to walk away? What do you think you would have done in that situation? And please, if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the History Happens Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most bizarre and fascinating moments. It does help me to keep doing what it is that I do every day. Thank you for watching.